Welcome to my next video, in which I will show you everything you need to know when working with Spring WebClient and Kotlin Coroutines. To be on the same page, this video will be a coroutine focused extension of my other blog post about Spring 5 Web Client with Spring Boot. So instead of duplicating the content, which works exactly the same regardless of whether you pick the Reactor or Coroutines implementation, I will focus on response handling. Nevertheless, if you are interested in other features like request bodies, headers, and filter implementation, then I recommend checking out that article as well. With that being said, let's get to work. Before I show you how to implement Web Client with Kotlin Coroutines, let me quickly describe the API we are about to query. Basically, we will be using three endpoints in order to fetch a list of all users, get user by identifier, and delete particular user by ID. The program you are seeing now is Mokun, and I highly recommend you to check out because this is a pretty useful tool when it comes to mocking APIs. As you can see right here, when we will be querying the user's endpoint with get method, then we will get a list of all users. On the other hand, when querying by particular ID, we will get these details of particular user. When it comes to the delete endpoint, each time we will hit the /users/1 endpoint, then we will get 204 no content response with empty response body, and lastly, when querying users/2 with get method, then we'll get 404 not found with this message payload. With that being said, let's open up IntelliJ. The first thing we will have to do will be to add some configuration. We will specify a custom bean of a web client type. So in order to do so, let's click on the package, right mouse button, new package, and let's call it config. Let's click right mouse button once again, new, and this time let's specify some class. I will call it configuration, for example. Additionally, we will have to annotate this class with a configuration annotation. So let's go with configuration, and please select the appropriate one from the Spring Framework.context annotation package. Nextly, let's define the new bean. So the first thing we will have to do will be use the bean annotation and implement a new function called, for example, web client. Fun web client. This one, as a parameter, it will take a web client builder class. So builder web client dot builder, and as a response type, let's mark this as web client. So web client will be the response type. Nextly, what I would like to do here will be simply specify a base URL for this particular web client. So each time we will inject this web client into any service or component, we will not specify the base URL of our API. So let's start with builder dot base URL, and right here we will have to specify the host and port we will be targeting. In Mokun settings, you can specify whatever port you would like to go with. I have defined that to localhost and port 8090. The next thing we can do here will be simply build. Of course, you can add right here your custom things, like for example, additional headers, which will be added to each request. Nevertheless, I am fine with this configuration, and basically this is all we have to do here. As the next step, let's implement a user response data class, which will be responsible for deserialization of JSON payload into a new instances of Kotlin classes. So let's click on the main package, new package, and let's call it, for example, DTO. Again, let's click on the DTO, new Kotlin class, and right here select the data class and call it user response. If you remember correctly, user response contains three fields: the identifier, first name and last name. So let's start with val ID, and this will be a long type. Nextly, let's go with first name, string value, and lastly, last name, also a string value. Additionally, we will have to annotate our fields with JSON property because our JSON structure was using a snake case, and right here we are using a camel case. So in order these values to match, let's go with JSON property and specify first name. Similarly, let's do the same here, JSON property, and this will be last name. Ctrl plus Alt plus L, formatting done, and basically now we can implement our new service. To do so, let's click on the root package, new package, and introduce a new one called service. I will call this user API service, so this will be a standard Kotlin class called user API service. Of course, we have to annotate that with a service annotation or component as well. This will be good here. And let's inject our web client, val web client of the type web client. So with all of that being prepared, we can finally implement our first function. I will call it find all users. So let's start with suspend function, find all users, and the response type will be a list of user response. User response equals, right now let's go with web client, get, in order to specify the HTTP method we will be using here. Nextly, let's go with URI, and as I mentioned previously, we don't have to specify the base URL, so we can go with /users only. Users. Nextly, let's invoke retrieve, and lastly, await body. As I have declared right here the return type explicitly, I do not have to provide nothing for the await body. Nevertheless, if this is not the case, then we will have to do right here and specify the type explicitly when invoking await body. Please keep in mind that the await body is a suspend function, and this is the reason why our function is a suspend function as well. Nextly, let's implement a new controller, which we will use to test this function. So let's click right here and add a new package. I will call it controller. And inside this package, I will create a new user controller. User controller. Of course, we will have to annotate that as a REST controller. Controller. And I will add a request mapping so that each request to this particular URL will be handled by this class. Request mapping, and for example /API/users. Nextly, let's expose a new get endpoint, get mapping, and create a new suspend function, suspend function find all users. This will take no parameters, and it will be responsible for invoking our previously implemented function. So I have to get back right here and of course inject our service private val user API service of the same type. Hit enter, and the last thing we have to do here will be simply invoke the function. With that being done, let's go to the main function and let's run our application. This may take a while. Wonderful. As we can see, the net is started on port 8080, and let's get back to Mokun and make sure that the external API is up and running as well. Let's click on Mokun, and right here there is this green icon which we can use to run the server. Server is up and running, so the next thing we will have to do will be to open up Postman. Let's go to Postman, click right here, new request, and right now let's specify the URL we have to reach out. So http://localhost 8080/API/users. Let's hit send. Wonderful. As we can see, we have received exactly the same value that we got from the external API, which indicates that our function is working properly. As the next step, let's get back to IntelliJ and make use of another variant of this function called await body or null. So let's click on the IntelliJ, open up our service, and let's add a new suspend function called find user by ID. Suspend function find user by ID, and this time it will take one parameter, ID of the type long. As a response, we will expect the user response, which will be of new label type. User response equals, and now web client, again get method, URI, and this time we will make use of string interpolation. So let's start with /users, and right here we will provide the identifier. Nextly, let's invoke the retrieve, and lastly await body or null. So this time, if the mono completes without a value, a null is returned. Nevertheless, please keep in mind that by default, when using retrieve, 400s and 500s responses will be translated to web client response exception. And in such a case, if we query for the user which does not exist, we will end up with this exception. Later, I will show you how to customize this behavior using onStatus. Anyway, let's get back to controller and add a new endpoint. So this time again we will use getMapping. Nevertheless, we will have to bind the identifier to the argument. Again, suspend function find user by ID, and this will be a path variable which will bind to the long. Nextly, let's invoke user API service find by user ID and simply forward this long value. Let's hit Shift plus F10 on Windows and enter to rerun the application. The app is rerun, so let's open up Postman, and this time let me specify /1 for example, because this time we should expect the value to be returned. Nevertheless, as I mentioned, with the value /2, we should get from the external API 404 not found, which unfortunately is not coughed on our side. And again, this behavior might be customized using the onStatus, what I will show you later. However, as the next step, let's learn how to transform our publisher into Flow. Let me open up IntelliJ, get back to the service, and as we can see, this function returns the list of user response. However, if we would like to work with Kotlin Flow instead, we can do that using body-to-flow function. So as the next step, let's implement a new function called findAllUsersFlow. findAllUsersFlow. This time it will not take any arguments, and as a response type, we expect this to have the flow of user response. So flow. Of course, please keep in mind to import the correct one from the Kotlin Coroutines Flow package. User response, and right now equals, let's invoke again the get WebClient.get. URI will be exactly the same as in the first one, /users, retrieve, and lastly body-to-flow. Underneath, the flags of user response will be converted to flow. Let's get back to controller and replace the invocation for findAllUsers. findAllUsersFlow. Let's hit enter, Shift plus F10, enter to rerun the application. The app is up and running. So let's get back to Postman and delete this. Let's hit enter. Wonderful. As we can see, everything is working as expected. So nextly, we can figure out how to work with Exchange instead of retrieve. And although I promised not to cover things twice, I believe it is important to say a couple of words here. The main difference between retrieve and exchange methods is that the exchange method returns additional HTTP information like headers or status. Nevertheless, when using it, it is our responsibility to handle all response cases to avoid memory leaks. And because of that, the exchange was deprecated in Spring 5.3, and we should rather use exchange to mono or exchange to flags functions. Of course, if the retrieve is not sufficient for our needs, because if we only need the response body, then we should always stick with retrieve. On the other hand, when working with Spring WebClient and Kotlin Coroutines, we can make use of the await exchange and exchange to flow functions, which I would like to show you now. So let's get back to IntelliJ. Of course, let's open up user API service, and right now I would like to show you how we can, for example, log the response headers. So let's add a new suspend function called find all users using exchange. Function find all users using exchange. This time it will not take any arguments as well, and as a response I would like to get a list of users. User response equals, just like previously, web client get URI and /users. Nextly, let's implement await exchange. So await exchange, and this will take the client response. From this client response, as I mentioned previously, we can extract additional informations like, for example, headers. So let's add a new variable called headers equals client response dot headers dot as HTTP headers. We can add, for example, a new logger here, which we will use to log response headers from our external API. So let me scroll up a bit. Private val logger equals logger factory from slf4j get logger, and we'll provide a class user API service class.java. Let me get back to our function, and we can invoke our logger info, and let's specify that we received a response from the external API with the particular header. So received response from the users API headers, and again string interpolation headers. Wonderful. The last thing we will have to do here, of course, if we would like to return the list of user response, will be simply to call await body on client response. So client response await body. As we can see, the compiler is complaining because await exchange is suspended function. So we have to do our function suspend function as well. And again, to rephrase that, we should usually stick to the retrieve in order to get the body. Nevertheless, if you want to perform some logic based on the response headers, then this might be a better solution for you. Again, now let's open up our controller. Let's use find users using exchange, Shift plus F10, stop and rerun. And again, we will open up Postman, but let's wait and see whether everything is working. Net is started, so we can query the endpoint once again. Wonderful. On the other hand, if we would like to again return the flow instead, we will have to use exchange to flow function. So let me open up IntelliJ, our API service, and this time we'll add a new function called function find all users using exchange flow. As a response, flow of user response equals, and this time web client get URI /users exchange to Flow. And just like previously, we can use the response to client response and log it once again. So let me copy the exact same value from here. And lastly, the only thing I need to do here will be to go with client response and invoke body to flow. This time I will skip testing because this will have the exact same result as the previous one. Nevertheless, let's look into the log because right here we can see that we received response from the user's API, and right here we can see all the headers that we got in the response. So at this point we have covered our getAllUsers endpoint and getUser by particular identifier. I have mentioned that we have one more endpoint to query, which is the delete endpoint and does not return anybody. In this case, I would like to show you two versions. The first one to return the unit, and the second one will be the await bodiless entity, which instead will return the response entity along with the void type. So the first one will be called delete users by ID, so this time it will be a suspend function, delete user by ID. It will of course take the identifier of a long type, and as a response I would like to get unit equals web client delete, because this was a delete endpoint, and again URI users slash ID retrieve, and lastly await body. And basically that's all we need if we are querying endpoint which does not return any payload. Nevertheless, if you would like to work, for example, with response entity, then we will have to query await bodiless entity. So as the last thing, suspend function delete user by ID response entity, this time identifier of a long type as well, response entity of the type void equals web client delete URI slash users slash ID retrieve and await bodiless entity. To verify, we can add another endpoint, user controller delete mapping. This will take the ID path variable, suspend function delete user by ID, path variable ID of a long type equals user API service delete user by ID and ID. Let's figure out how does the first one work. So Shift plus F10, stop and rerun, and in the meantime let's go to Postman and make one adjustment here. We have to change the method to delete and add the path variable. Let me verify, double check, the app is up and running, so let me get back here, hit send. Wonderful. As we can see, we got 200 OK response from our endpoint. Nevertheless, if we would like to directly call the external API and forward the HTTP status code, then we can change to the second function. So simply, I'll go right here, delete user by ID, response entity, rerun the application, open up Postman, hit send, and this time we can see that 204 no content response is returned. So as the last thing, I would like to show you how to work with the onStatus function. As I mentioned previously, this works the same way regardless of whether we use the Project Reactor implementation or Coroutines. So finally, let's get back to IntelliJ, open up API service. So this time I would like to add a function which will search for a user by identifier, but in case the external API returns 404 not found, I would like to return 404 not found as well to the consumer of our API. To do so, let's add a new suspend function and call it find user by ID, for example, not found handling. So find user by ID not found handling. Similarly, ID of a long type, and as a response we'll get the user response because we will either throw the exception or get the user response. Web client, the method will be get, the URI will require the string interpolation, so user/id, nextly retrieve, and the onStatus method. This will take two arguments. The first one will be the predicate, so instead of handling every exception in the same way, we can only apply this function to a particular responses. So in my case, let's add a function response status. Response status equals HTTP status not found, and I would like to throw a meaningful exception to our consumers, so throw response status exception HTTP status not found. Lastly, what we'll do will be simply call await body, Ctrl+Alt+L. Let's go to controller, replace this function invocation, find by user ID not found handling, and rerun our application. Again, Shift plus F10 is the shortcut for that. Alternatively, you can click in this upper part of IntelliJ. Let me go to Postman, change to get once again, and firstly, let's figure out whether the endpoint is working at all. So right now we should get the user details. On the other hand, if the user is not found, then we should get 404, which works wonderful. And that's all for this video. Together we've learned how easily we can implement a Spring Web Client with Kotlin Coroutines and Kotlin Flows. As always, you can find a link for the written article in the description for this video and a GitHub repository link where you can find the whole source code. If you enjoyed the video, then please leave a thumb up, and I will really appreciate your feedback in the comment section. Thank you once again, and see you in the next videos.